Welcome to the Thinking Theologically podcast, where we teach you how and why you should think theologically. I am your host, Spencer Shaw, joined by Jack Dodgen. Jack, how are you doing?
Good. Doing well. Glad our roles are reversed again. It's great.
But not for long.
We're only one more after this.
We're about to finish up this series on spiritual realm related things, and then the roles will revert back to, I guess you could call their normal. I don't know. Statistically, I guess,
Proper.
if you counted episodes.
Yeah, statistically normal.
That would be our normal function, though we haven't been like that in a while, I guess. But
as God intended.
We'll probably return back to this format at some point.
The good created order.
So, as you said, we have this episode and one more where we will be talking about spiritual realm, unseen realm related things, like we have been for quite a few episodes. I don't know how many off the top of my head, but we've been doing it for quite a few episodes. Real quickly, a couple things to be looking forward to from the podcast. As of the recording of this episode, my book that I think we've mentioned before about church culture is now out and available, both on our website and most places that you find books. It's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. There's a Kindle version that's on Kindle Unlimited. So if you're a big reader and you do Kindle Unlimited, I know a lot of people who do. You can go and read it there. And we should, a week after this episode, have an episode coming out where we specifically talk about the book, and we'll have more book-related things coming out as time goes on as well. We mentioned in our last episode, maybe, or it might be the one that's coming out next week.
Might be the interview episode,
but,
about the book.
we, coming in October, as we get ready for, if you didn't know it, we have a big election that's coming up in November. And so in the month of October, we will do all things politics. We have a lot, and I mean a lot, of political related things coming out. The goal of which is to help you, as this podcast is called, to think theologically about politics, not to tell you what specifically to think about any certain political person or issue, but how to think theologically and biblically about politics. This is something that Jack and I did as a part of a series here at my congregation, and when I taught it, I said that there are 3 P's that we are not going to address. People, parties, and policies are all no-goes. We're going to talk theology to help you perhaps think about people, policies, and parties, but that's kind of the same thing that we're going to be doing in our series. So be looking forward to that come October. But as for this episode, we are continuing in the unseen realm. We are going to be moving to the New Testament now and talking about Jesus and the supernatural, which I'm excited about. This is a little bit more in my area of expertise, though supernatural things, as we said when we got this series started out, is something that Jack has spent considerable more time studying than myself. But Jesus is my guy. He should be all of our guys, but he's particularly my guy because that's the area of the Bible that I do the majority of my study and reading on. So I'm excited that we're now going to think a little bit about Jesus and the supernatural. But before I turn it over to Jack to begin this discussion, a couple of introductory things to real quickly mention.
Something went wrong. Let's try again.
Hold on.
There we go. See, we're being punished now for our reversed...
Yes.
We've done this too long where we've had the reversed hosting. Now Siri wants to get involved.
Siri wants to get involved. Okay, a couple of things.
This is the problem with AI, Spencer.
We have an episode on that, by the way.
Yes, we do.
Okay, so where we've been, last episode, we looked at the sacred spaces and places of the Bible. We looked at gardens and mountains and how they overlap. We talked about temples and their mimicking of gardens and mountains, particularly of Genesis and the Garden of Eden. And the final sacred space and place that we discussed in that episode is the wilderness, where God tends not to be, but sometimes shows up. And it's important when God does show up in the wilderness. And that's going to be important for our discussion of Jesus in particular as well. And I think that's where Jack's going to start. That's where we've been. So where we're going is today we're going to discuss, as I said, Jesus and his interactions with divine forces throughout his ministry. Today's episode will draw on a lot of what we have studied previously. But first, we'll begin with what is kind of standard belief for most people as they read through the Gospels, some things that you'll notice, some episodes that I'm sure you've heard before. I don't think there's any particular ideas or concepts or scenes in the life of Jesus that we're going to be talking about that are going to be new to you, but thinking about them in the context of the background of the Old Testament and even a little bit that we dabbled into the intertestamental literature and the Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha, all of that background stands behind some of these episodes in the life of Jesus that we're going to be talking about. So, Jack, why don't you start and talk to us a little bit about Jesus and the wilderness, and I'll turn Siri off so we don't get that interruption again.
Perfect. I'd love to hear what she has to say on this subject. So if you have not listened to the previous episodes, there might be a temptation of like, oh, Jesus interacting in the spiritual realm. I want to learn more about that specifically. I'm glad that you do. You need to have, like any good New Testament study, you need to have the foundational Old Testament understanding before you can really understand what's going on within the New Testament. That's especially true of the spiritual realm stuff. And admittedly, it's this episode and the next one is us and the unseen realm, the Ephesians 6 sort of thing, our placement and the warfare, as Paul calls it there. So we're spending a little bit of time in the New Testament. There are a lot of passages we're not looking at that we could. But I feel like this one and the next one are pretty good as far as applying everything that we've looked at to here. So this is the heavy Romans 12 and beyond kind of thought process now of applying the concepts to us as people. And we'll get to see what we've said throughout the Old Testament is Jesus is going to accomplish this thing. God is working to do this thing through Israel. Jesus is going to bring it about. Christians will carry that on. And we'll see those this week and next. And we're going to start with Jesus in the place we identified as being mostly bad in the last episode, where the wilderness is regarded as a place of death, place where God is not, even very specifically in our Leviticus passage that I don't know that we spent a ton of time with, but Leviticus 16, whether they believed it at that point, and I think you could argue that they could, they certainly came to believe this later, that there was actually a desert demon that lived out there, that this is just not a good place. So they regarded the wilderness as not good. And this is where we find Jesus very early on within the Gospels. We get a little more expansion in Matthew and Luke than we do, say, Mark, who gives us like a verse and a half, if even that, of the wilderness temptation. But from Matthew, it serves a greater narrative purpose in what he's trying to do. So before we actually talk about the wilderness temptations, I just want to lay out very quickly this thing that Matthew is doing in his gospel. The Gospels are arranged in such a way that they remind us of something old while still revealing something new. They walk down paths walked down before, but approach things differently in light of Jesus. For example, the opening of the Gospel of Matthew retells the story of Israel's exit of Egyptian slavery, an event that we already talked about in the past, was full of supernatural activity there with the plagues and potential interacting with gods and beliefs there with Egypt, all the way to the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. And here's kind of how Matthew just very quickly goes through, and might pause before we actually dive deeper into the wilderness part to just run all this by Spencer and see if it's accurate. This is my understanding of these things. So you have Jesus in Matthew being called out of Egypt in very similar fashion to how Israel is called out of Egypt. Jesus is there because of all of these firstborn being killed off, all these Hebrew men being killed off by Hebrew babies, eventually men, being killed off by Herod, causes Jesus to run into Egypt. Similar thing we see there with Moses and Pharaoh and the killings of all that. So even the reason of going into that area is all similar. Jesus passes through water on the way to Israel, just as the people of Israel passed through water on the way to what would ultimately become the nation of Israel. That's Matthew chapter 3. And this is one of many actions that will connect Jesus to being like Israel, but better, and also like Moses, but better. There's a bit of both going on here. Jesus then goes into the wilderness for 40 days, very symbolic of Israel's 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. Jesus then announces after this the kingdom of God through instruction about who those kingdom people are. That's the Sermon on the Mount, which many of us are familiar with. And this is very similar to Moses's receiving and giving instruction at Mount Sinai in Exodus 19, where he talks about God wanting the people of Israel to be a kingdom and what those kingdom people are going to look like. And you can continue this kind of thread from here. Matthew 4 is where we're going to focus in on in just a minute, but you can already see how Matthew is propping Jesus up as, you guys remember that Old Testament stuff we studied? This is the guy. This is the one that we're waiting for. As Spencer said, this should be your guy. This is the one that you want to follow, because he's proving proving that to us by tracing narratively Deuteronomy and Exodus and all of this journey that Israel and Moses went on, and saying Jesus is doing the same thing but better. Spencer, is that good understanding? Is that good approximation of what's happening here with Matthew and what he's trying to do?
A couple things to add real quick that bear nothing with where you're going, but I just think it's interesting. So for those of us who are Bible students and are interested in this, because you can keep getting into the Moses connection, the 5 teaching sections of Jesus in Matthew, which reflect to the 5 books of the Torah, which were attributed to Moses. Moses goes on top of a mountain to receive the 10 Commandments, and Jesus preaches on top of a mountain. There's other things throughout. But to me, this is the most interesting thing to notice, and you've got to fit what I'm about to say somewhere into your understanding of inspiration. But only Matthew, Jesus ends up in Egypt. That's not... So only Matthew and Luke have a birth narrative of Jesus. Mark doesn't. John doesn't. John's is pre-existence of Jesus, and then Jesus starts his ministry. But there's
John goes way back.
There's no birth narrative. And Luke does not include this Egypt thing. The reason that Matthew has it is to do what Jack just did. So you take Egypt out of it, and it's a little harder to see this connected theme for the beginning of, because all this is happening, that Jack points out, before Jesus starts his ministry. In and out of Egypt, water, going into the wilderness, and then he can begin his ministry and proclaim the kingdom of heaven. Heaven is actually plural in Matthew, by the way, so it's the kingdom of the heavens. I think I've mentioned that in previous episodes. So I've become of the habit of saying the kingdom of the heavens because it's actually more accurate, and I think is better for more correct understanding of heaven. You can go back and listen to our episode on that. But the reason that Matthew includes that is because he's trying to emphasize this connection. And something else to me that's interesting of Matthew wanting to make sure that we understand all this is, so I've mentioned this before, it's generally accepted that Matthew and Luke use Mark in the composition of their Gospels. It's also believed by many scholars that Matthew and Luke use Q, which is Quell, which is German for source. So there was some other source that they share in common, which is how Matthew and Luke can have sections that agree word for word. They don't just sound similar. It's almost obvious that they were copying something, but it's not found in Mark. Anyway, I say all that to say what's interesting is if you compare Matthew to Mark and you look at the material that is unique to Matthew, that's either not found in Mark, or even the material that's not found in any of the other Gospels, like the things that are unique to Matthew, they are all found, for not all, the majority. Someone did a percentage. I want to say it's 90-something percent. The majority is found in the teaching sections of Jesus. So what does Matthew do? Matthew takes Mark's story and he's like, okay, I want to do something different with this story. I want to retell it, but I want to do something different. Now, how do I get all this material in there? Well, Matthew creates these teaching sections of Jesus. Whether or not he actually taught for that long or he's pulling teachings together doesn't really matter. Matthew creates these teaching sections, and that's where he inserts all of his unique material, is into these teaching sections. And so for Matthew, he retells the story, but Jesus now becomes this teacher. He lumps them all together in 5 teaching sections because Jesus isn't just any teacher. He's a teacher like the great teacher in Moses, which is also why you have similar material in Jesus' Sermon on the Plain in Luke and his Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, but Matthew's is a lot longer and it's on top of a mountain because Matthew's crafting that teaching section to fit in. So there's a lot more I could say on that, but
Yeah.
I just wanted to emphasize Matthew's doing something very, 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 very specific, and it's obvious.
Yes.
And he's trying to do this thing with Jesus and Moses and Israel and the coming of a kingdom.
Yeah, Matthew, like, I think the general reader gets this. We should be thinking about the Old Testament connection when reading through Matthew from that usage of this is to fulfill what the prophet, whoever had spoken. We get a lot of that specific phrase. And so we're intentionally like called to specific places within the prophets a lot of the time or about Jesus. But this is easy for us to miss. The Jewish audience would have gone, oh, yeah, okay. Like this is very obvious. It's an intentional plan of Matthew to draw us to Jesus following the same narrative path of Israel and Moses, but doing it differently, which is why we come to the wilderness here specifically. So remember that the wilderness was where Israel faltered in one of their first tests of obedience. We get them out there and they start grumbling, complaining. They want to go back to Egyptian slavery. So you have that element of this. Jesus is going to not to do those things. Not grumble and complain, not long to go back into, being enslaved, but to want to free everyone. But also, number 2, the wilderness is regarded as a place of death, of evil, apart from God, all of this sort of stuff that we discussed in the last episode about sacred spaces and places, and talking about how the wilderness is most often talked about. Again, it's not that God isn't there, but God shows up specific times throughout all of that. And when he does, you take note because it breaks the general understanding of how that place works, which is pretty cool. Like with Hagar or with so many others, this place of death is now a place of life because God's there, because he can do that. So you have God going into the wilderness here, Jesus, who goes in to be tempted. The text will say by Satan, which I'm pretty sure done a specific podcast on, talking about how the word Satan is used in the Bible. But I think we've also had that discussion just within this particular series. I don't know. We've definitely talked about it. Spencer may have more he wants to say. It seems to be the case that as we go through the Old Testament, first of all, regardless of this phrase, we've already noted a plurality of evil beings throughout the Old Testament. There are just all these pointing out of these types of things. But that the word Satan, adversary, which is used of Yahweh within the Old Testament, and I know we've said that before, is seen as just a generalized term for any number of things, used for God, also used for evil beings. But when we come into the New Testament, development would be the word, that in between Old and New Testament, there's this development of a like singular evil entity. That being said, that's not even still really the case. We've got demons all over the place. We have evil spirits or unclean spirits as well all over the place. So we still deal with a plurality of evil. The presentation to us now, though, is that Satan seems to be used in a singular kind of way, as opposed to the more broad kind of plural way within the Old Testament. There's more that we can say about that, but we'll move forward here from that. Okay. So unlike Israel, Jesus, who is going to be actively tempted here in this wilderness, is not going to succumb to the evil that is around him, but is going to stand firm with God and his word in obedience. This shows Jesus to be better, like Israel, but better, an Israel that will not fail in its task. We're pretty familiar with Matthew's temptation narrative, I think. Of all of the ones, Spencer being an exception here, he's probably more familiar with Luke than anything else. But I think for most of us, Matthew is kind of the book we're most familiar with. It's the first one that a lot of us read when we go into the New Testament because it's the first one there for us. Sermon on the Mount is wildly popular as well, even for unchurched individuals. That's not necessarily as true now as it used to be, but Matthew feels a little bit more at home. So we tend to be more familiar with the temptations as they're presented there. It's turn the stones to bread, jump from the temple, and up taken on top of a mountain here are the three temptations. Interesting to note, Luke reverses the second and third temptations. I don't exactly know why. I think I know why Matthew is doing what he's doing here. I don't know why Luke's doing what he's doing where he's at. Maybe that's the original and Matthew is doing the mountain thing at the end, because Matthew cares about mountains. He's got a thing about mountains.
Yeah,
go ahead, Spencer.
I would argue, again, some of this stuff you have to fit into your understanding of inspiration. But yeah. Jack asked me this. I don't know. One of the times we've recorded before this, you asked me that question, and not having studied that particular question, reading it seems most likely to me that we talked about Luke doesn't have a reason to want these in a particular order that I can see. So Luke has an emphasis on food. So bread would be the only one he would care about, and that's not the one that moves.
Right.
Between the two. Matthew cares most about mountain. I think we would both agree. And that's one of the ones that moves. So it seems the best explanation to me that perhaps Matthew flips them to make mountain the climax of the
mountain
story,
and kingdom,
because
for that matter.
That's what he wants. Yeah. So I don't know. Matthew has a lot more invested in it because all of these imageries are important for Matthew because Matthew is Old Testament. Jesus comes out of the Jewish tradition. Yeah. He is the embodiment of Israel. He is the new Moses. He brings the kingdom of the heavens. So language of kingdom and temple and all of that would be important for Luke. Food's important, and then Jesus as food, which is connected to Jesus' ministry to the poor and the outcast. And then Jesus is prophet, which is also connected to his ministry to the poor and the outcast, because that's mostly what the prophets speak against, is the treatment of the poor and the outcast. So it's like poor and outcast, and then sub things, food, table fellowship, prophet. Yeah. Those kinds of things.
So Matthew is invested in the mountain and kingdom idea, which kingdom is all the kingdoms of the world belonging to Jesus if he bows down, is the ultimate like crux of that temptation. That's what the temptation is. So thinking about these temptations and purpose, first temptation obviously addresses the hunger that Jesus is feeling also directly parallels all of the greatest source of angst for Israel is we just want to eat something. And now we don't want to eat this anymore. We want something else. That was always the seemed to be the biggest issue. And here the one that Israel fails at is the first try here, and Jesus has no problem with this. And in all of these, by the way, there is quoting from Deuteronomy to confront Satan and what he is saying here. They're all from Deuteronomy. Notably, there's a quote from Satan out of Psalm 91. I say notably because next week we may bring that, or the next episode we may bring that up. So just hold on to that. But Deuteronomy is getting a lot of quotes here. Again, Matthew is tracing a lot of Deuteronomy for Jesus is Moses here. So the second temptation of using Scripture to make Jesus prove who he is to Satan seems to be what's happening here. We're going to use Scripture to get Jesus to jump off because God will not let this happen. Now, it seems that maybe there's an element of it would show the Jewish people who Jesus is and all of this. I think there's an element of, and when I say I think, it's also others who think this, that there's an element of feeling out, is this the guy? Jesus would not be the first to make the claim to be the Son of God, Messiah, and all of these things. And so Satan does not appear to have, just unbound knowledge of things and all of that. So there does seem to be a feeling out of, is this truly the individual I'm looking for? Because they're aware of a Messiah. Demons say, "Have you come to torment us before the time?" They are aware of certain amount of process and plan, which makes sense to us if this has always been part of the plan and they have this information from being connected to God at one point. So that makes sense. But Satan's probably trying to feel things out here. That's Michael Heiser's take on it at the very least. And that seems to make some sense given what we find out when we go to the mountain section here in just a little while. But then the third temptation, and this one seems very clear, Jesus is tempted with why would this be tempting? That's the question. Jesus is given a solution to his mission. So here, Jesus can, quote unquote, fulfill his mission of bringing all of the nations of the world to himself without having to go through the death of the cross. The big problem, of course, being, though, the catch, that you would have to bow down before Satan. That's not going to work. That's not how this mission is going to be fulfilled. But it's a temptation because Jesus is there to do that. Remember, Jesus is not just fixing the Genesis 3 separated from God thing. He wants to deal with sin and its consequences. One of those consequences being the nations and their scattering away from God. But God has always wanted to, since Abraham, I want to be a blessing to all nations. I want to draw all nations. That's what Jesus is going to accomplish as well. This is a temptation, as it's listed here. Psalm 82, just to bring it back to mind, and by the way, Deuteronomy 32, here's Deuteronomy again. Both of those places have this expectation of God reclaiming the nations, re-inheriting the nations, possessing the nations again. And this is what Satan seems to know that that's what the Son of God is going to accomplish or desiring to accomplish, to bring all the nations of the world back to himself. To reset to redeem the creation in that sort of way. So this would be a real temptation. This would be a real thing. All of these would be temptations. And the first one about hunger makes sense. Second one about temple, I think, makes sense if it's Satan trying to feel out if this is truly the individual. And the third temptation, because of our information about Psalm 82 and Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9 are the specific verses. Because of our knowledge of those things, the third temptation, we can understand why that would be tempting, of bringing the nations back to you now. Here it is. If you just bow down, you can have them all. I know that's what you're here to do. From this, Jesus, who doesn't give in to any of these things, Satan leaves until an opportune time. So there will be a return of all of this. something that Matthew very explicitly shows us happen as well as we get through his gospel. But we're not quite there yet. We'll get there when we get on the mountain. Spencer, any thoughts about those temptations before I talk about some of Jesus' kingdom work stuff?
Nope.
Awesome.
Not at the moment. So yeah, let's jump into kingdom.
Okay. So from here, after Sermon on the Mount, this is what the kingdom of God looks like, or the kingdom of heavens. Bible Project, by the way, I think put out the Lord's Prayer, and they translated skies, which isn't an inappropriate language. The idea of not seeing those things as overlapping, earth and skies, that they're so.
Yeah.
I think that's what they're going for. We should see that as an overlap, so I understand that. Heavenlies is another way that I've heard that, and Paul will use it in the plural in Ephesians. But from here, Jesus' kingdom begins to work, and he calls his disciples. He starts casting out demons who are just all over the place in the New Testament. Jewish belief is that they are the fully spiritual manifestation, I guess is the right way to say that, of the once physical Nephilim. They get that idea from Isaiah. That idea is present in First Enoch as a book. So these demons are everywhere. Jesus is casting them out. But then, as the kingdom goes along, the 12 disciples are called. 12 of them, because even though there are more than 12, this phrase of the 12 represents these tribes of Israel, the people of God, casting out and being his people, a light to the world, all this. All Old Testament connection stuff. They are sent out along with many others. It looks like 70 total is what we get. This is out of the limited commission of. I'm taking us into Luke now, but Luke 10 has the limited commission as opposed to the Great Commission of Matthew 28, go into all the world. Limited commission is go into the surrounding area. So a little lessened in scope, 2 by 2 they go out. But I bring in Luke's gospel in particular because we get a very strange phrase here. Strange unless we have the spiritual realm understanding of things and all this. So the 70 are to go out, prepare the way for Jesus and all of this. 70 being a specific number, an important number. When we think back to the Tower of Babel, and again, Jesus is here to reclaim all the nations. When we have the genealogy listed there in what is called by most scholars the Table of Nations that are represented there, you will find 70. And that same number is here on the limited commission. What we have then is this idea of Jesus sending out these individuals to all the nations in a symbolic sense. 70, go reclaim all the nations here, come back, because Jesus is going to fix the Tower of Babel problem. The nations being scattered and dispossessed. Jesus is going to fix that problem. And we get this, and I'll read this, Luke 10, verses 17 through 20. This says 72. You might have 72 in your translation. You'll also maybe have that in the Tower of Babel genealogy. 70, 72, depends on how you count it. That's just a known variant thing. Anyway. The 72 returned with joy, saying, Lord, even the demons are subject to us in your name. And he said to them, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. That's our weird verse. Behold, I've given you authority to tread on serpents and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall hurt you. Nevertheless, do not rejoice in this, that the spirits are subject to you, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven. This idea of Satan falling like lightning from heaven, I see the enemy losing. They're losing their foothold on the people, the nations. The things are turning now towards the kingdom direction. And that's taking place with Jesus sending out on the limited commission. That'll happen in a grander scale. We think about Acts 2 being quite literally a reversal of the Tower of Babel. Jesus is accomplishing the goal, the hope of Psalm 82, the hope of Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9. Jesus and his disciples are carrying out the reversal of the nations being sent away and bringing them back to God. And so you have this tremendous thing that starts out of the wilderness, moves into the kingdom. Jesus' kingdom is going out, and he is doing that third temptation the right way, reclaiming him in the way that they are supposed to be reclaimed, with his people going out, being a light, bringing the nations to him here. And it's from here that we'll go to the mountain. But before we do that, anything to add there or throw out or question or, I don't know, correct?
So if Luke has in mind Genesis, which I think you can argue that he at least has in mind the Tower of Babel, because I think that for Luke, Acts 2 is a reversal of the Tower of Babel. You get multiple languages. Acts 2, everyone hears their own language.
And to that point, real fast, the Septuagint of the Tower of Babel section has very uniquely two of the words, the two words that only occur together in one other spot, and it's Acts chapter 2. So there seems to be a linguistic connection as well.
And you might want to argue, off the top of my head, I don't know whether you would, but you might want to argue that that's connected again to Luke's idea of Jesus' ministry to the outcast and marginalized, which a part of that is also Jesus' ministry to Gentiles, because that's going to be important for Luke as well. So what's one of the barriers to entrance into the people of God? Well, language is a barrier between people groups. So you've got to solve that problem. You've got to bring in the Gentiles. So you get Cornelius. You've got the Ethiopian eunuch. Eunuchs weren't allowed into the temple, and so you now have a eunuch that's entering in. You now have the languages just of God's people are now united. Everyone hears their own language. We're talking about just Jews in Acts chapter 2, and then Cornelius gets brought in, and so it seems to be a part of Luke's larger project that he's going for. But if Luke's thinking about Genesis, then I don't think it's too much of a stretch to think that Luke, when he's talking about casting out demons and Satan falling from heaven, that he has in mind potentially Genesis chapter 6. Wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility if Luke is thinking Genesis here. And so I believe, now correct me if I'm wrong, isn't that phrase, I saw Satan fall from heaven, a Lucan thing? That's not...
I don't remember anybody else saying anything.
I don't think the other Gospels have that, which is where we get Satan's a fallen angel from, which is not what Jesus says, first off.
Yeah, there is that Ezekiel passage that maybe parallels that we talked about in a previous episode. But that's it.
Never mind. We'll do it. We'll probably do an episode on this at some point in time. But if that's the case, there's a lot of ifs here. So if Luke is thinking of Genesis, which I think we can solidly stand on the footing of yes. Now, the bigger if is if Luke is interpreting Genesis 6 in the way that some Second Temple Jews did, as reflected in the Enochic tradition. That we have no way of knowing. Does Luke agree with that interpretation, or does he not? But if we assume that he does and understands that demons are connected to the angels that fell in Genesis 6, then putting the phrase in Jesus' mouth of, I saw Satan fall from heaven, for Luke could be a reference to Genesis 6 and a reversal of the Genesis 6 problem as well as the Genesis 10 problem, which would make Satan actually make Satan a fallen angel, but not one, a group of he would be representative of a larger whole. But for Jesus, he's not even talking about fallen angels in this. His point is not there's this fallen angel that's going around doing these things. It's we still have brokenness in the world because of the angels that fell in Genesis 6. And that's because demons is a big thing in both Well, in all the Gospels, because it shows the power of the kingdom. Mm-hmm. Like, how do you know that Jesus is bringing the kingdom of God? Well, he casts out demons. Like that's a big deal for him to do, to defeat the kingdoms of evil. So keep that in mind as well in the whole Satan discussion of, first, Jesus doesn't say he was a fallen angel, but two, if you interpret that as a fallen angel, I think it's better to refer to it as a reference to the group that fell in Genesis 6 and then say, but that's not Jesus' point. He's not actually talking about them still doing things.
Well, we'll have more on that too here in just a minute on the mountain.
So that just something to, that's not a fully developed thought that I have. It's a half developed idea. So take it for what you will.
Fair enough.
Okay. Are we ready to move on to Jesus and on the mountain?
Yes. Okay, so we had wilderness, and Jesus prevails within the wilderness, followed by his kingdom. Warfare, I think, is perfectly fine. The enemy is losing ground. Like, the kingdom is going out, and people are being prepared, and we start to see the nations come out to him, with the Gentiles coming out, and John's gospel is the better one for this idea. But it's the Gentiles coming out is when that phrase of now's the time to be glorified, where that switches to, yep, it's time, as opposed to time hasn't come to be glorified yet, talking about his death. So speaking of his death, when we get to the mountain, and Matthew has us on mountains in several places, Sermon on the Mount, all this. When we get to the mountain, that sacred space that we've discussed, some tremendous things that happen here. One of the greatest admissions in the Gospels is that of Matthew 16, where Peter recognizes Jesus as the Christ, the Son of the living God. It's after this point that there is a shift in the Gospels to focus on Jesus' upcoming death. If you are reading through Matthew, go read about what happens right after we have the Great Confession. Jesus will repeatedly in Matthew's Gospel tell us of the suffering that he is about to go through, that he's going to die, that he will rise again, and all of this. So it's like now that they moved past chapter 1 now, and they've unlocked the next set that comes after this. Great. You realized who I am. Good job. Now you need to realize what I'm here to do. I'm going to die. That seems to be a turning point, not just in the Gospels and for the disciples, but also for these spiritual things that are also seeing all of this. Satan's waiting for an opportune time to come after him in all of this. The next chapter over, so we have the confession, we have the get behind me, Satan thing said to Peter, because he's not on the same wavelength yet. He understands who this guy is, but not quite what Jesus is going to do. That's the thing that we need to correct now in Matthew's gospel. We get this insane moment on top of a mountain with the transfiguration. And all of these are kind of wrapped up in one place. So the confession of Peter in Matthew 16 takes place in Caesarea Philippi. This is the area that if we equated it to Old Testament geography, and this is all Michael Heiser's stuff. So he's done the research and the work on this, studying the other scholars, etc., and all this. I'm just parroting it here at this spot. But the area of Caesarea Philippi is the area that was formerly where King Og of Bashan was noted as being, known as the place of the serpent over time later on. Place that the Old Testament, this is again Deuteronomy, by the way, that notes this as being ruled by giants. Valley of the Rephaim, that's this place. So this place over time is just Caesarea Philippi, not quite known as that anymore. But within the Old Testament, this is a place that was known as being a central hub for these rebellious things against God. So there seems to be a connection here of if you were going to declare war against the enemy, this would be the place to do it because you're going to be heard, if that makes sense. That's kind of how we should think about this. Outside of Jewish history, Greek culture and Rome thought that this was the area where you had the connecting place to the underworld. If you've ever, the animated Hercules, I think, is a good representation of this. You could just walk into the underworld. Like if you found it, it was like a cave and it just kept going and like, hey, you're in the underworld. That was a thing that you could do. It's just connected to Earth. So you could leave this plane, kind of walk down into there, and there you were. That was the belief that the Greeks had and Romans had in all of this. Well, they thought that place was here. So this area of Caesarea Philippi, biblically speaking, once ruled by these evil beings that were rebellious, or the offspring of those rebellious to God. In Greek culture, understood as a place where the connecting underworld tunnel is. And then in addition to this, at this time, one of the they had a huge temple to Zeus within this place, who would have been a major, if you wanted to say, competing religious figure with Yahweh. It's going to be Zeus. Zeus is a big deal, and the Roman gods are the Greek gods, just renamed and reskinned and all of this. So there's a persistence here to this. So here's the summary of all of this. Evil place, where Jesus is having this pronouncement made by Peter that he is the Son of God. And if Satan didn't know that in the wilderness temptation, he certainly knows it now. And so maybe it's not a coincidence that after this confession, it's, I'm going to die, because those wheels are set in motion. Those things are going to occur here and all of this stuff. One last thing that we need to bring up with all of this is it is in this area where the mountain that is specifically noted in 1st Enoch is mentioned, where the angels made their covenant against God, is here within this place. That's potentially the mountain that Jesus goes up on in Matthew 17. My understanding is that historically, and I can't remember which mountain it is, that if you look at the early church fathers, they note somewhere in the 300s, I think, that like this is the mountain that Jesus probably was transfigured on. But then when you dig into that, I think it was Augustine. I think it was his mom that was like, I think it was this mountain. And so he wrote that. That is what Heiser's suggestion is about the history. But the mountain that makes the most sense from Caesarea Philippi is Mount Hermon. Like that's right there. It's the one that you would see. The other mountain that other scholars have noted in the past is nowhere near this. Doesn't make sense. And Mount Hermon makes sense for a lot of spiritual reasons. So you have modern day temple to Zeus. You have previously the Valley of the Rephaim, place of the serpent, which hasn't been good throughout our Bible theming and studying. Connection to the underworld. This is a horrible, evil, awful place. And this is where Jesus, you are the Son of God, the Christ, the Son of the living God, is said. And it's here that you have the transfiguration take place in Matthew 17. It's here that Jesus says he'll build his church and that the gates of Hades, the place of the dead, will not prevail against it. Nothing's going to stop the kingdom. Following the confession, we go up on the mountain. Jesus is transfigured. It's said from heaven here for the second time in Matthew's gospel, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." And this time it says, "Listen to him." It didn't say that at Jesus' baptism in Matthew 3. This is probably the mountain where, Jewish belief at least, the angels made their covenant against God. So just imagine these angels come down here to this mountain and spit in God's face, basically. And then Jesus, all these years later, goes back up to that mountain and directly says, nope, yeah, I'm here, and this is what we're doing. That's the idea that we should have when we look at this. So immediately following this, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, after the confession and the transfiguration, we start marching towards Jesus' death. It seems that his calling out the evil being sets the wheels in motion for, we're going to get Jesus killed. And the Gospels kind of note that in different ways. Judas, and John is the money-hungry one, and so that's the angle here. You throw Caiaphas in there as well with all of that. The Pharisees are also doing this work. But those powers that you see, there's always something behind that. And Jesus, it looks, intentionally provokes these things on their home turf because it doesn't really belong to them. It actually belongs to God. And what they think will win them the victory is the thing that causes their downfall, is ultimately what happens here. So the summary of all of this, and then Spencer can add, close, however we want to finish this episode out. I don't know. The ministry of Jesus was not merely one of freeing us from sin, the problem of Genesis 3. It's also to punish the rebellion of Genesis 6 and reclaim the disinherited nations of Genesis 11. Jesus was here to take away sin and its consequences. His life, ministry, and death accomplished just that. And with Jesus in the wilderness and on the mountain in Matthew's gospel, we see not just the Genesis 3 thing, that's always there, and his death on the cross will solve that separation problem, but he's also going to the place where this rebellion is birthed and speaking against it, and he is actively within this area where being tempted with and then goes and does it himself. The nations have been disinherited, and he says, I'm just going to bring those things back. We watch Jesus not just solve the sin problem and its separation, but all its effects on the world. That will affect the way that we view creation, the new heavens, new earth stuff. That'll affect the way that we believe that we should live and exist within the world. It's going to affect a lot of things about how we go about serving God, living for him, and all of this, and that'll be what we focus on in the next episode here. That's all I've got for this one, I think, unless Spencer has questions or stuff to add, because there's a lot of verses we skipped in the New Testament about Jesus. 1 Peter 3, does he go into where these evil spirits have died? And Heiser thinks so. We didn't cover it here. That makes for a good question for our email, if somebody wants to send that. How can they reach out to us?
Just about in any way, real quick.
Yeah.
Something that just think about, and this isn't directly connected to the spiritual realm question and Jesus on the mountain. So I won't dive into it, but just to kind of put it in your mind, and we mentioned this when we were looking at mountains in the Old Testament in our last episode, is, it's also connected to Jesus being the new Moses, right? Moses goes up on top of a mountain. That's where he receives the 10 Commandments, and Jesus goes up on top of a mountain. He's transfigured. He's declared to be God's son. And so some of this mountain language, Jesus going on top of a mountain to preach and proclaim as well in the Sermon on the Mount, all of that stuff is connected to some of these more spiritual connections with mountain and wilderness and spiritual beings, as Jack had pointed out. But it also connects to who Jesus is being presented as the new and greater Moses, in what he's doing in establishing the kingdom of the heavens, of defeating the problems, not just of Genesis 3, as Jack pointed out, but really all of Genesis 3 through 11. Jesus is solving all of those problems. So the authors of our Gospels are doing several things. Also of note, the Transfiguration is not found in the Gospel of John. That has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but it's very, very interesting to think about when you think about of particularly authorship of the Gospels.
One thing to add real quick that I forgot to say, in case we missed it talking about it, because it's been a long time that we talked about it. The very specific region of Caesarea Philippi where King Og was at and all that stuff, Moses is the one who defeated him. And that's a thing that we pointed out there, that Moses, Joshua, David, Jesus is a type of all of those individuals, or they're all a type of him, however you want to say that. And so that's just another connecting thing with Moses, of Moses defeated this thing here in this place. Jesus came back to finish the job. It's all over Matthew. It's very cool.
Well, that I think is the episode. We will finish up Unseen Realm in technically, I guess, 2 episodes, because we'll have one coming out next week, hopefully, on the new book. But you can reach out to us with questions, comments, concerns. If you've got criticisms, you can direct them towards Jack. or anything even of Unseen Realm related things that we haven't talked about or didn't dive all that deep into that you would like us to, you could put that in there as well. You can contact us at strongchurchministries@gmail.org. You can also find both Jack and I and Thinking Theologically on Facebook. You can find myself and the podcast on most other social media platforms as well. Make sure to also check out our website, thinkingtheologically.org. You can get in contact with us through the website. You also have access to a lot of additional content to what we just put out on the podcast. So go check us out there, and the audio and the video on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, all of the different places that you can listen to it, as well as on the website. If you do find us on any of those social media platforms, make sure to follow us or subscribe to the podcast. That will help us out tremendously. That is the episode. I'm Spencer, that's Jack, and thank you for joining us.